I guess I will just get started. Hi, everyone. Good evening. This is the webinar entitled The Contemporary Importance of Asian American History, Bridging Past and Present. This event is sponsored by CSUN China Institute, the University Library, the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, and the local community organization CHEER. It is a great honor for me to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Philip Hutchison from the Asian American Studies Department at CSUN. Dr. Hutchison received his BA in Asian American Studies and Chicano Studies here at CSUN in 2000 and earned his MA master's degree in Asian American Studies at UCLA in 2002. Dr. Hutchison completed his Ph.D. in Cultural Studies at George Mason University in 2012. Since 2003, Dr. Hutchison has been teaching at CSUN, offering courses primarily in racial theory and legal and political history. Dr. Hutchison also teaches with the Educational Opportunity Program. He started working with them in various capacities in 1997 and has been teaching with their transitional program since 2006. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Hutchison.
Hey, all right. Thank you, Professor Huang. I appreciate that. As we were talking before, obviously, I think everyone can hear me. I'll do the screen sharing. I'll be actually sharing the screen in just a moment. It can always be good. Obviously, we'll be having, of course, a Q&A session afterwards. But if there's anything, as I teach a lot, I realize I can look at the chat. For here, the questions will come later. But if there's any challenge, if there's something I may not be realizing, maybe I hit mute on accident, which I do sometimes, then you can alert me to that. To use the chat there as well. And so, I like fun reading. I'm sure many of us do as well. The reading beyond, the classes that we have. And I remember in high school that I remember for just a brief moment, just for a year or two or so, I really got into like science fiction, fantasy novels, like Tolkien and others. And, so that's one thing I remember about high school, just for a little while. And that I got into those kind of novels. So I was thinking this would be good for us. We could start with, just looking at some fun reading. And so let me share the screen. This is what we'll know right away if this is working. I think it will be. Let's do some fun reading right now. I don't know if any gamers are in here. We can read something that's related to the Sony PlayStation. So let's do some reading together here. So let me share the screen. There we are. And I'm going to need to move the, because it's hard for me to read with the, there we go. I had to put the things on the bottom or I can't read this. So let's read this together. So it says here, binding individual arbitration. 14.1, purpose. The term dispute means any dispute, claim, or controversy between you and Sony Interactive Entertainment, LLC, Sony Interactive Entertainment Incorporated, or any of their current or former affiliates, including parents or subsidiaries, or any predecessor or successor entity to any of the foregoing, including Sony Computer Entertainment America, LLC, and Sony Interactive Entertainment America, LLC, collectively Sony entities, regarding PSN or PSN content, or the use of any PlayStation devices or any devices sold by a Sony entity to access PSN content, whether based on contract, statute, regulation, ordinance, tort, including fraud, misrepresentation, fraudulent inducement, or negligence, or any other legal or equitable theory. Oh boy. And includes the validity, enforcement, or scope of this, for some reason in capital letters, binding individual arbitration section, with the exception of the enforceability of the class action waiver clause below. Dispute is to be given the broadest possible meaning that will be enforced. If you have a dispute with any Sony entity or any of a Sony entity's officers, directors, employees, and agents, it cannot be resolved through negotiation within the time frame described in the notice of dispute clause below. You and the Sony entity that you have a dispute with agree to seek resolution of the dispute only through arbitration. That dispute in accordance with the terms of this section and not litigate any dispute in court except for those matters listed in the exclusions from arbitration clause. Arbitration means that the dispute will be resolved by a neutral arbitrator instead of in a court by judge or jury. That has to be the most boring thing I've ever read in my life. I guess I should say, when you talk about fun reading, I mean, isn't this PlayStation stuff, right? I guess I should have warned everyone. This is what we would call fun reading with the scare quotes, right? And if you look at the terms of service, because that's what I was reading from, if you agree to, join PS, the network that they have, the online, that thing, I could spend the entire time here reading from that. It goes on and on and on. And so it is so often with law and policy. And if you get bored by that, it can be easy. It's easy to think the same way about laws and policies. They can be the law, can be very dry. We have, rules and ordinances, regulations, this, and, arbitration, that. And it can be very, again, bland, dry, boring, but also opaque. Opaque just meaning that it's very difficult to engage, right? We can get lost in all the words and all the little different clauses that they have, all the technicalities. And because of this, the law can be very difficult to access, and it could become fairly alienating for people. And I would say that one challenge of this is that this also, in many ways, in its own way, as we'll see, in a different sense, applies to many laws and policies that have governed our country since its inception. So it is with laws and policies involving racial groups, such as African Americans. Last week's, that Dr. Cedric Hackett gave on Juneteenth. And so it is with Asian Americans, the various laws and policies. And as Professor Huang noted, I teach courses on politics and law, and I'm taking the same kind of approach that I take, many of the things I say, both the subject, but also the approach that I take for it, that I tell students from the beginning, it's understandable. A lot of the laws, I said, can be very bland, but at the same time, we in a sense have to be able to engage these laws and policies, because without understanding them, we're never going to truly understand US history, especially the history of, again, racial groups, African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, and so forth. And then we have to look at these laws and policies. And I tell my students one way in which to engage them, to get, to kind of pour through all the boring technicalities that litter so many of these laws and policies, is the one way to always be thinking about it, as I always approach it, is to say, to look at the stories, the human stories that are behind these laws and policies. Who are the people that were behind these laws, that were behind, in what ways were their lives directly impacted by all these laws, many of which are littered with technicalities. It's just all these big words, just like we read in that PSN terms of service. And that was just one clause of like 500 that are in there. And we think about, for example, again, recalling last week's lecture, we think about slavery, right? Slavery was not just a custom, but what people, decided to oppress. They translated those desire to oppress into laws and policies up right through the Civil War, right prior to that, you had the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Of course, the decision Dred Scott versus Sanford, a very infamous decision that is also extremely long. Both the opinion, if you put the opinion dissents together, it's basically a novel length opinion practically. And so within there, again, a lot of students tell me that, when we read court cases, they express that to me. It can be very hard to engage, again, because they're talking in very legal formalities. And that's what my focus is here, in large part, beyond getting to the specific aspect of Asian American history, is to really say, let's look beyond, how can we bring life to a lot of these laws by looking at the lives of those who are directly impacted, for better and usually for worse, as a result of these laws. We also look at the ways in which, again, people of color, such as Asian Americans, the ways in which they also fought against, when these laws and policies and oppression that they experienced, they didn't just sit around and just take it. They fought back. And we can look to these, to these individuals who fought the oppression that was being aimed at them. Again, the focus here, that I'm looking at is the legal oppression, using the force of law to oppress people's lives, to make their lives more difficult. And if we look at Asian American history, we can understand, right, just how much was there. And so we think about it today, right, to truly understand and appreciate Asian American, history, as well as the impacts of these laws, the ways in which these laws continue to have impacts today, then it's unavoidable, right? We want to look at areas like the media. We want to look at media representations, different, customs and the like. Those things are obviously very important, but so is the law. And even though the law can be dry and boring, we can still look at it in the way to, to really engage it is to look at the lives of the people who are impacted by them. And also, and again, just as we see, as I said, bridging past and present in the title, is to say, in what ways did these laws, even though they are long gone, long since repealed, in what ways do these laws still impact the lives of Asian Americans today? And I always, we think about, we can look no further than the recent spike in anti-Asian hate crimes during the pandemic. And as I was telling my students and others, as I say, these hate crimes are tragic, they are disheartening, but they are ultimately not surprising. And they're not surprising because if we look at Asian American history, we can appreciate that we've seen this before. This has happened before. We have seen this kind of repression in different contexts, of course, aimed at Asian Americans. One of the main, which I'm not going to focus much on here in this particular discussion, is, of course, the internment of Japanese Americans. The parallels between Japanese American internment and what we are experiencing today, the parallels jump right off the page. And we see that they ultimately are part of the same root. And this root often has what might seem, is really the dark underbelly of a larger stereotype. And I'll be using the chat a couple times as, beyond the PowerPoint that I'll be sharing as well. A stereotype that many Asian Americans have direct familiarity with, which is often called the forever foreigner or the perpetual foreigner stereotype. It's like, many Asian, and maybe some of us in here can relate to this. When they get into a conversation, with somebody who is not Asian American, they ask you, well, where are you from? And you might say something like, oh, I'm from Los Angeles. And they might reply with, where are you from? And it's like, oh, and then you might reply, oh, I'm from Los Angeles, I'm from Sherman Oaks. And then they might say, no, where are you really from? To which you might reply, I'm really from Sherman Oaks. My parents were born, I was born in Sherman Oaks and my parents were born in LA. And they might say something like, oh, well, you speak English really well. And we start to realize just how much that shows up, that idea of Asian Americans as forever foreigners, as perpetual foreigners. This idea that Asians can never be truly American. They're always going to be somehow magically attached to their home country. This, of course, was the exact idea that animated Japanese American internment, the idea that Japanese were going to be engaged in some fifth column activity because they were somehow racially attached to Japan, even those who had been born here. Right. And we see it, it shows up in so many places. It's one of those I can go on and on with the examples. I'll just give a couple from the realm of ice skating. I remember back in the 90s, Michelle Kwan, who was a really well-known ice skater, who was Asian American, and she was defeated in one of the Winter Olympics in, I think, 1996, or 98, I believe it was, by Tara Lipinski. And this one MSNBC had the tagline and the title for that, American beats Kwan. And it's like, but Michelle Kwan was born in California. Unless we think that's just something that happened 20 something years ago, I'm thinking of even the most recent Winter Olympics just a couple of years ago when Japanese American Mirai Nagasu performed a triple axel, which in ice skating is a very rare feat. And so there was a lot of celebrations around it. And one New York Times editor, she tweeted about it. She said, immigrants, they get the job done. And it's like, it's the same thing, but Nagasu was born in California. And so Barry Weiss, who's, I don't believe she's any longer with the New York Times, she got, called out on it. And her response was, oh, I was talking about her parents. And a lot of people kind of were like, and we don't know about that, right? There was no context to suggest she was talking about, Nagasu's parents, right? That they're the ones who get the job done, that there's no context to assume anything other than she was talking about Mirai Nagasu herself, even though she was born in California. And again, I could expand those examples exponentially. I could go on and on. But we see that we start to understand, though, that this sort of thing, all these, the challenges that come with a forever foreigner, these assumptions of foreignness, that you must be somehow attached to, a country in Asia, is we see again, the pandemic, from the pandemic to Japanese internment is also, you could call it the dark underbelly of this stereotype, the ways in which this stereotype operates in very sinister ways. The idea that Asians are somehow responsible, which we know because many of those who are committing these attacks are making that clear, that race is directly on their minds, that somehow Asian Americans, and I've had some friends who have talked about that, right? A friend of mine who was Korean American, when I was living on the East Coast, I had seen it on social media. She talked about how she was at the DMV And a white woman behind her made it very clear she wanted not anything to do with her and made it clear that her Asianness was a part of that. And so again, we can go on and on with the examples of that. But it's asking the question, and this is how I often start my legal and political history classes, not necessarily with a PSN terms of service on the PlayStation, but to say, in what way, where does this stereotype come from? And we can appreciate that, if we look at Asian American legal and political history, well, then we can understand it a bit better. We can see that this stereotype is not inevitable and it is not random. But this stereotype, especially, again, it's not just the annoyance, what some would call microaggressions or what have you. It's much more than that, right? That it produces real world violence and real world oppression and shattered lives. And so we owe it to ourselves to understand the source of this stereotype better. Similar things could be said about the idea of Asians as a model minority, right? We can look again to law and policy to understand where these stereotypes didn't, again, come out of nowhere. There's roots to these. And hopefully through my brief discussion here, we can have a better understanding of where this stereotype, especially the forever foreigner, which will be the focus here, where that stereotype comes from, that we can look to the media, definitely the ways, right? We know there was just a recent, debate about Dr. Seuss a few months ago. And you look at some of his cartoons and you see the ways in which he depicted Asian Americans, such as Japanese Americans during World War II, drawing them all to look the same, assuming they're all involved in sabotage, fifth column espionage. Appreciate the power of the media. But we can also look at in what ways the laws and policies themselves serve to create and really reinforce this idea that Asians can never truly just be American. Unlike, say, for example, white people can just be said, if I tell people, oh, I grew up in LA, I'm not going to get that follow-up question, right? They're going to say, oh, so do you go to the Disneyland a lot? It'll be something like that. And so we can look at law and policy as a very important means by which to understand better. Where does this come from? Where does this stereotype come from? And how can we do something about it today? Just like those, as we're going to learn right now, those Asian Americans, at least one in particular, who fought against the laws and policies being aimed at him, in what ways can we fight today? And there are people fighting right now. And that's one of the encouraging things. We've seen a lot of solidarity between Asian Americans and other racial groups. That's very encouraging, that we can start to turn the page to something better, that we can say that we're not, we don't have to just put up and just say, just throw our hands in the air and go, it's just inevitable. Certain people are going to be the victims of violence, that it doesn't have to be this way, and that we can imagine a better world. But at some level, as I say, bridging past and present, at some level, we do need to look to history as well as to the legal history as a means to help us understand where these things come from and to better equip ourselves to to help us do, figure out what we can ultimately do about that. And so ultimately, the question, like I say, the question, where are you from? Why is that such a loaded question? Well, let's get a better understanding of why that is. And so if you look at Asian American history, two major ones, this is not the totality, meaning everything here, but we see that so many of the laws, involve two issues. The first one being, and I'll put in the chat here, immigration, and the second one being citizenship. I found, this is one thing I can usually type pretty quickly. There'll be a spelling error, I'm sure, somewhere in there. And so we find, especially if we compare it to today, right, a lot of the anti-immigration, rhetoric is aimed largely, for the most part, at those coming from Mexico, Central and South America. And we can easily forget that for most of our history, most of our immigration policies and the anti-immigrant hysteria was actually aimed at Asian people. And we'll be learning a little bit about the immigration. I'll be talking briefly about that here as we move forward. We also find that there's issues of citizenship, and that's actually going to be the main focus. I'm going to be focusing on citizenship because the individual in the court case that this individual was a part of was focused on citizenship. The idea that for most of our history, Asian immigrants, for instance, were never allowed to become naturalized citizens. So when people immigrate here after a certain period of time, they can apply for naturalization to become a US citizen. But up until the 1940s and not fully until 1952, Asian immigrants were classified in the following way. They were classified as aliens ineligible to citizenship, meaning it's not simply when they came here, anybody who immigrates here is not a citizen. They're non-citizens when they initially come here. But it was different because Asians could never become citizens. That places them in a different legal category. It wasn't simply that they weren't citizens. They could never become citizens. And so as we'll see, that in its own way is at play in what we're going to look at right here. And so we can look at, so here, looking at citizenship and how the citizenship in particular, as well as immigration, contributes to this, this stereotype of the forever foreigner. I want to share the story of one Chinese American who lived in the mid-late 1800s into the 1900s. An individual by the name of, I always want to type it out first, an individual by the name of Wong Kim Ark. And I want to share his story. Again, to look at the laws and policies, but to use his story as a means to go beyond them, to look at the people's lives. What was at stake? Who was Wong Kim Ark? How did he feel? What was he fighting against? What happened to him that he ultimately went before the Supreme Court in 1898 in the case called United States versus Wong Kim Ark? And so by looking at his story, we can understand, and in many times as I move forward, I'll be making these calls back to let's put ourselves in his shoes, right? To give life to the individuals, to go beyond, because again, you're going to see, I'm going to be quoting from the case a couple times, right? There's going to be, I'm going to be looking at, certain other laws and policies, again, they can get really technical. But in those technicalities, I want to encourage us to be thinking about that. In what ways did these laws, how did these laws, impact him? How is his life personally going to be impacted by these laws, by the decision in his court case? What would that mean for him and other Chinese Americans in his shoes? So let me give a brief history before we get into his case, a brief history of not just Wong Kim Ark and his biography, but how he relates to other Chinese Americans. See, one thing I'll be saying here near the end, especially as we talk about the contemporary relevance of this case, how does this case come up today? A lot of our history, and I took AP history. I got a 4 on the exam, took it long time ago. He said, but Professor Huang mentioned I'd been with EOP since 1997, so it was before that. I got a 4 on the exam, but a lot of this, perfect. Yeah, you can get some information there. There's a lot of good information about this case. One thing I wanted to also mention, I can mention it here, being reminded, is this is a case that has a lot more importance than we may initially appreciate. This case doesn't get as much attention as, say, something like Plessy versus Ferguson, or the Dred Scott case, or Brown versus Board of Education, or even the Korematsu case, which dealt with Japanese internment. But I would say this case still continues. It has a lot more importance today than we may realize. And I hope to make that clear, especially at the end of the lecture, later now in my lecture. At any rate, and so we can look at one thing that made Wong Kim Ark. He was born in 1873. And one thing that made him relatively exceptional among Chinese Americans is that he was born in the United States. And this makes him not just, again, the overwhelming majority of Chinese Americans, the earliest immigrants here, were immigrants. So we're very few Chinese Americans who have been born in the United States. So Wong Kim Ark was a relative minority in that regard, and the fact that he was one of the relatively few Chinese Americans who had been born on US soil. The overwhelming majority of Chinese Americans had been immigrants. And if we know the history, again, one thing, as I said, talking about going back to the AP history, is this is not a history I learned very little about, even though I was in AP history. Right? I learned much more about the journey of European immigrants who were also coming at this time through Ellis Island, right on the east, in New York. And so, but at the same time, there were many Asian Americans, Asian immigrants coming from China, then later from Japan, Korea, the Philippines, and India in the late 1800s through the early 1900s. Whose stories, again, in mainstream history often get silenced, and we learn very little about them. So let's look just briefly, so we can get a context for Wong Kim Ark's situation, and why his specific, that became ultimately his court case. And so we know that many Chinese, the first large number of Chinese immigrants, some we had seen a very small number who had come prior, like in the early 1800s, but the first major Chinese immigration here to the United States was in the 1850s in the context of the gold rush, in which they were pulled here by the promise of riches, that there was gold. They also worked, as we, in early history, as we know, on the railroads. But right away, we know that many had experienced, racism right from the beginning. And again, it's one thing to say, as I always talk about racism in racial theory, it's one thing to say, well, I don't like you, and so I'm going to treat you badly. But it's another thing to say, I'm going to it's not just that I don't like you, I'm going to translate my negative feelings and I'm going to make laws and policies against them. And it's the whole idea of race, some people call racism prejudice plus power. And that's where that idea is coming from. It's saying that who has the power to translate their ideas into laws and policies like slavery? Who has the power to do that? And so it's saying that this is what they start to do, right? White people in California start to translate their, anti-Chinese sentiments into laws and policies. And again, there's much more than I have time here to go over, but we can talk about the foreign miners tax, in which Chinese as well as Mexican, miners in gold miners were given a tax every month that greatly made their financial prospects much more difficult. We can look at various cases. One I definitely recommend, I can speak more about if anyone has any questions about it. The 1854 case, People versus Hall, which was in California, which the ruling was that Chinese were not allowed to testify against white people in a court of law. Basically, what it resulted in, the case ultimately resulted in a white man who had murdered a Chinese man basically got away free, right? He was not convicted of the murder because the witnesses who had testified against him that he had murdered a Chinese man, who were themselves Chinese American, their testimony was taken out because of this law that they said that argued that Chinese were not allowed to testify against white people in court. And so, again, unfortunately, I could go on and on with the examples about not just the violence, both the personal violence, as well as the legal oppression that was aimed at Asian Americans and Chinese Americans here, and later, of course, other Asian ethnic groups like Japanese and Filipinos, and the ways in which their lives were directly impacted by this. And so, as I said, I already wrote it up here. One way in which it also appears is in citizenship, and declaring that those Chinese who are immigrating here would be classified as aliens ineligible to citizenship. And so so it didn't matter how long they had been here, if they intended to stay in America, they ultimately were, they ultimately could not become citizens. The overwhelming majority of these early immigrants from China were male, again, it was about a 26-1. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'll add a reference. Yeah, especially at the end, I can remember that. And so for sure. And so we see that the overwhelming majority were men. And so there were very few women who immigrated here in the early years. Many of them, and I will put this in the chat here, many were kidnapped and forced to work as prostitutes. And there's a famous case of one, her name was Lalu Nathoy, her American name was Polly Bemis, who had been basically sold to smugglers in China and basically kidnapped and forced to work as a prostitute in America. She was rescued. And her story, she'd moved to Idaho, and she's still a very famous figure for what she did in helping others who were in her situation. There's a movie that was, I believe, in the 90s that was made on this called 1,000 Pieces of Gold. Highly recommended. That deals with, that's involving not just her story, but the stories. And again, we think about these laws and policies, these are the human stories, right, of struggle, of, the different oppression, and that so many Chinese Americans, both men and women, especially in this regard, in which they faced, right, in which women were forced into prostitution with almost no means, and definitely no legal means to improve their situation. And that's why someone like Lalu Nathoy, right, becomes, such a great figure because of those, and her and those other Chinese, as well as, other people of color and their white supporters who sought to help them, to say that, not to, to allow this oppression to continue. But at any rate, we see, we can appreciate, this is a kind of history is, very much important part of California and US history, is what, the role of Chinese American, Chinese immigrants in this early time. Because of this, though, I also bring that up, this helps us understand why so few children were being born. Slightly over half of the men who were coming here were married, and they left their families behind in China. But very few, because there were so few women, there were very few, relatively few children being born. So in 1873, right, so we're about 20 years after the first significant immigration of Chinese, we see that now Wang Qingmark was born. And so we find, though, that not just in citizenship, but also in terms of immigration, this anti-Chinese sentiment is now starting to translate not just into these laws and policies like the foreign miners tax, the ruling in People versus Hall, but it's also starting to result in basically, calls for their exclusion. And that ultimately culminates in the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, the first and only act that directly named an ethnic group, a racial group for exclusion from immigration. There were others, but this was the only one that was directly, that actually named a group. Right, many Japanese were excluded by the Gentleman's Agreement and later the 1924 Immigration Act. Filipinos were excluded by the Tidings-McDuffie Act of 1934. But we see this is the only one where they were explicitly named by ethnic group. And so as a result, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act was almost completely exclusionary. Other than the occasional merchant, there were some provisions for merchants and diplomats. But beyond that, right, it was meant to be almost completely exclusionary. But there's a situation. So now we have to think at this point, Wong Kim Ark is 9 years old when this happens. His parents, he's still being raised here in America. And what happens is that for many white people, they weren't satisfied with the Chinese Exclusion Act. And they wanted it to be even harsher. And that's exactly what happens. And we see within 6 years, because initially, they just taught to type that out so I have it ready, is initially those Chinese who were in the United States, if they left, they could come back. They had to have these certificates of return, but they were allowed to come back. But many said, many, especially white Americans, basically said, we don't want that to happen. And so in 1888, they passed another act that adds on to the Chinese Exclusion Act called the Scott Act. As we'll see, this one is even more directly involved with the situation involving Wong Kim Ark. And so the Scott Act said, those Chinese who leave the United States, if they leave, they are not allowed to return to the United States. This was challenged in a court case 1 year later called Chai Chan-ping versus United States, where the unanimous Supreme Court said that the United States had every right, the sovereign right to regulate their borders. And so he lost the case. So it upholds the Scott Act. So it says those who leave the United States, they are not allowed to come back. And so again, at this point, so Wong Kim Ark is about 15 years old. A few years later, his parents decide to move back, in part because of this oppression and exclusion. His parents decide to move back to China, and he goes with them. And so now he's 20 years old. So this would be in the early 1890s. He says he was a cook. Wong Kim Ark was a cook, and he decided that he had better prospects in the United States. So he decides to return to the United States. Note that this is after the Scott Act, which stipulated that those Chinese who leave are not allowed to return. But again, this is why it's important that Wong Kim Ark is in a different situation, because unlike his parents who were immigrants, they were aliens ineligible to citizenship. But Wong Kim Ark was in a different situation in that he was a citizen because he was a citizen by birth. And so because he had been born here. And so he comes back and he's allowed re-entry here for that reason. A couple years later, in 1894, he then returns to China to visit his family. At this point, he then comes back to San Francisco, and this time he meets another immigration enforcement officer named John Wise. John Wise was very anti-Chinese, and he wanted to do whatever it took to exclude as many Chinese as possible. And basically, John Wise was looking for a fight. And Wong Kim Ark was exactly the fight that he was looking for. And so John Wise says, unlike the first time where he came in without any problems, this time he comes back and John Wise tells him, you can't come in here because of the Scott Act, right? Prevents you from being able to return because you're Chinese. Wong Kim Ark says, but I have to be able to come back because I'm a citizen. And Wise says, no, you're not. Even though you were born here, you're still not a citizen. Wong Kim Ark then ultimately, and again, this is one of the moments where we can take a step back and think about put ourselves in his shoes, right? Wong Kim Ark's shoes. What would you do in this situation? Again, a rhetorical question in this regard, but it's saying that, do you fight? He did. Wong Kim Ark fought it all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And again, I should have put it up here, but we saw the reference earlier in the chat there. Thank you. Which ultimately comes the case, United States versus Wong Kim Ark. That, of course, is in 1898. And I'll be talking, and that's what we'll be looking at in the last, the second to last major portion here before we talk about to end with the contemporary relevance of this case. And so think about it, right? Part of it is we have to remember that, as I always tell my students, every case we look at in that class, every Supreme Court case, every court case we look at, every one of the judges and justices of every case was a white male. Just like the Supreme Court, in the U.S. Supreme Court, every justice was a white male until Thurgood Marshall, joined the Supreme Court in the late 1960s. And so that's another aspect we have to think about, right? That you're going up against the highest court in the land, which we already know from these previous cases have not necessarily been very friendly to Chinese American interests, usually not. Just like we saw, as I mentioned briefly, with the Chai Chan-ping case, they unanimously found against him. And so let's look now at this case. Here where it's going to get a little dry and technical, but and that's what I'll be continuing to do, is to call back to the human stories, to be putting ourselves in his shoes and the shoes of other Chinese Americans and the ways in which this ruling can impact them. So let me share the screen here. So first, I actually meant to do this earlier, and that's, sometimes happens, right? So this was Wong Kim Ark. Here's my, let's see if it works here within there. So Wong Kim Ark, the issue involving his case, of course, deals with the 14th Amendment. So here, let me switch about that. I thought I could switch from slide to slide, so I'll just do it separately here. So so I'll be going back to the PowerPoint in a moment. And so the focus of this case, like any Supreme Court case, is going to deal with a law or a policy. The Supreme Court, as I'll say, they do not make the laws. That's the job of the Congress and the White House. That's their job. The job of the Supreme Court, they do not make the law. And I'm going to put it here because it's so important, this particular word. They don't make the law. They interpret the law. And that's what they're doing here. They're going to be interpreting a certain part of, let me re-share the screen here so you can see it. They're going to be interpreting here specifically the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. Now, as we know, right, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were all right after the Civil War, right? The 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, the 15th Amendment dealt with voting rights, especially to protect the voting rights of African Americans. And we also, of course, have the 14th Amendment, Section 1. Now let's look here at Section 1. Let me just read it out here, and then look at which parts of this ultimately were a part of this case. So it says here, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Because I want to type it in the chat, and it's hard to get to here. It sometimes doesn't work for me. So I will come back to this in just a moment here. But I want to put in the chat so we can, just so we can look at it. This Section 1 thus has 4 different clauses here. The first one, I'll put the numbers here. The first one, of course, it's called the Citizenship Clause. The second one is called the Privileges and Immunities Clause. And I spelled that wrong. That's fine. And the third one is known as due process. And the fourth clause is known as equal protection. And in my classes on legal and political history, we end up engaging all of these. Here, this one primarily, chiefly engages the first one. That's the one we're going to focus on here. But it also, in its own way, involves the Privileges and Immunities Clause. So let's go back. Let me share the screen and go back to this. What does that mean, the privileges and immunities? Why is this also important? If you look at the 4, the privileges and immunities, which is this one right here, see if I can, no, there's no way to me to highlight that part, that's fine. It's different from the others. If you look at the wording, we find that the other 3, the Citizenship Clause, the Due Process and Equal Protection Clauses refer to persons. But the Privileges and Immunities Clause involves citizens. So even though this isn't directly a part of the case, this is not what they're looking at, it's the very important background. It doesn't say no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of people. It says of citizens. So what does that mean? Well, we see that citizens get various privileges and immunities. For example, only citizens can vote, right? In this case, only citizens, and this especially relates to Wong Kim Ark's circumstance, you cannot, someone who is a citizen, for example, here in the US, if you're a citizen of the US, a US citizen, you cannot be legally barred from entering the country that you're a citizen of. And so he has that privilege being a citizen, right? We know other Chinese immigrants, because they were aliens ineligible to citizenship, they did not have that privilege because they were not citizens. They could never become citizens. But because he is a citizen, supposedly, and again, that's what was being questioned. As I mentioned, John Wise said, you're not a citizen even though you were born here. And so that's what we mean by the privileges. He gets privileges, but also immunities. Immunities basically from maybe hostile legislation, such as the Scott Act. Recall, the Scott Act said, if for those Chinese who leave the country, if they leave the US, they cannot return to the United States. But as a citizen, because he is a citizen, he is immune to those restrictions. In other words, the Scott Act doesn't apply to him. If he is a citizen anyway, the Scott Act cannot apply to him, even though it said that Chinese, he doesn't get that. He's not restricted by the Scott Act because he is a citizen. And so that becomes, so we see that even though that the Wong Kim Ark case is not directly dealing with the privileges and immunities clause. That's the background of it, right? So it ultimately becomes then about the citizenship clause. I'm actually going to go to the next slide here. That's just going to have, so I'm just repeating from the previous slide, just so we can focus on the citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment. This is what the case was ultimately about. So he says, again, just repeating, it says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. This is what was the focus of this case. It was basically interpreting not just the whole clause, but ultimately a very specific part of it. So we're not going to focus on the naturalization because he was born here. So the focus is, it says all persons born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the US. And this is what they were going after. Those like John Wise, who were opposing Wong Kim Ark, this was their focus. They said it didn't, the citizenship clause doesn't simply say all who are born here are citizens of the US. It says all people born here and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. And that's what this case is ultimately hinging upon. So I'm going to it's important enough here that I'm going to put it in the chat. I'm going to have a very important question that I want to put in the chat here. And it all comes down to this particular question. Is it basically ask, what exactly does it mean subject to the jurisdiction? I'll just say, we can say jurisdiction thereof or just jurisdiction here. That becomes the all-important question. What exactly does that mean, subject to the jurisdiction thereof? What does that mean? And so here's where we, again, very important, we can think about it and put ourselves in Wong Kim Ark's shoes about how, because that's what this case is going to do. The justices are basically interpreting what it means to be subject to the jurisdiction, right? What exactly does that mean? And so we need to think to ourselves, if they define this phrase in a way that does not include Wong Kim Ark, well, that means he is going, he's going to have to permanently leave the country that he was born and raised in. If they interpret it such that he is not included in that, he is not subject to the jurisdiction. Because again, that's what the citizenship clause doesn't simply say those who are born, born in the US are citizens. It adds that qualifier and subject to the jurisdiction. If they argue that, then he is not a citizen and he will be legally barred from the country. If they interpret it such that he is included, that this definition does include him, then he is ultimately a citizen by birth and ultimately becomes he is ultimately a citizen, and thus he can re-enter the US. And so that's also, we see here, so many of these court cases are really hinging on that kind of technicality. Again, it's hair splitting. It can be, again, as dry and boring as the PlayStation terms of service, but his entire life hangs in the balance. What is his future going to be? What kind of opportunities and where will he live? All of that is hinging on how the justices are going to interpret this kind of opaque kind of phrase. It's sort of, what is that? Again, what exactly does that mean? Subject to the jurisdiction. In short, for those familiar with the case knows that he won the case. In a 6-2 ruling, the Supreme Court ruled that Wong Kim Ark was a birthright citizen, that the birthright citizenship clause did apply to him, that subject to the jurisdiction, basically, just in brief, the Supreme Court basically argued that everybody born is subject to the jurisdiction with very few exceptions. For example, the children of diplomats, of ambassadors. If, say, another nation was to invade the United States and a child of one of these enemies, was to be born on U.S. soil, they would not be a citizen. It also excluded Native Americans, and that's important in its own right? To say that would be another important conversation to have about the role of Native Americans, saying that they were subject to the jurisdiction of their reservation, of their individual tribe. That wouldn't be till 1940 that Native Americans were allowed to, were birthright citizens. All Native American tribes were classified as birthright citizens. And so he's saying, so ultimately the majority opinion written by Horace Gray, I'll be sharing a slide with his name on it in a moment, basically said, because Wong Kim Ark is not a part of those exceptions, he's not a part of those groups, therefore he is subject to the jurisdiction thereof and is therefore a birthright citizen. And so, as we'll say, and I'll talk about as I come to a close here, is to say that this is why this case is still important today, right? By them ruling that, that opens the door for all other people, for example, other Asian immigrant groups today to be who came in later, their children will be classified as citizens because of the Wong Kim Ark decision, basically saying that beyond these narrow exceptions, again, not even Native Americans, they're no longer an exception, obviously, that beyond these very narrow exceptions, if you are born on US soil, you are a citizen, period, beyond those narrow exceptions. And so briefly, though, we can also appreciate that two of the justices said no, that not that two of the 8 justices who sat on the court, who participated in the ruling, said no, we don't believe Wong Kim Ark should be a birthright citizen. And here it gets even more technical, so I'm just going to be real brief about this. They argued that by subject to the jurisdiction, that actually meant completely subject to the jurisdiction. Basically, that's another way of saying, for them, completely subject to the jurisdiction basically meant that they had that in order to be completely subject to the jurisdiction, individuals had to completely renounce their allegiance to their former country. And they argued that this was impossible for Wong Kim Ark and his parents because of previous treaties that had been signed between the United States and China. And because of this, it was ultimately impossible. And they argued that Wong Kim Ark's citizenship should follow his bloodline, basically because his parents were Chinese citizens, so should he be. But at the end, they were the dissenting opinion, so it doesn't become binding law. But it's important to point that out, that even there, right, even in that, there were still several justices who disagreed. Unfortunately, we find it's even more negative because, we can say, wow, this was such a victory for Wong Kim Ark, and it was. But we also find, unfortunately, that it wasn't totally out of the decision here. And let me get to the next slide here. I want to give a quote from Justice Horace Gray's majority opinion, and then we can appreciate why there was still some baggage here, that it wasn't just a uniformly pro-Chinese ruling. So let's look at a passage from his opinion here. He wrote in the middle, he writes, "To hold that the 14th Amendment of the Constitution excludes from citizenship the children born in the United States of citizens or subjects of other countries would be to deny citizenship to thousands of persons of English, Scotch, Irish, German, or other European parentage who have always been considered and treated as citizens of the United States." So he's basically saying, right, as we see here, the fear was that if they were to rule against Wong Kim Ark, that ruling could negatively rebound to those millions, at that point, millions of immigrants who were coming from Europe, many through Ellis Island, who are part of what they call the grand melting pot of America. But it's always to remember that that melting pot did not include Black people. It did not include Asian immigrants, right? It didn't include, Mexicans and other, Latino groups. It was really for European groups, Italians, English, Irish, and the like, right? That was the grand melting pot. It was never meant to include, for example, as I said, Asian Americans, African Americans, and others, right? This melting pot was just for European immigrants. And so we see that even in what seems like a uniformly pro-Chinese ruling, we even see here, right, that there was a qualifier here, right? Ultimately, they were saying that if we rule against Wong Kim Ark, this, as I said earlier, could negatively rebound to other groups. And so even there, we see it's not as pro-Chinese as it may seem right on the surface. And so we can appreciate that even though, right, we still see that even though Wong Kim Ark, was given birthright, that and other of those who were born here, Asian immigrant, or not immigrants, but their children who were born here, were classified as citizens, this idea still swirls around, even among the children, right? And so we can appreciate then this constant belief that Asian immigrants and even Asian Americans, as I always put it, the way I always phrase it with my classes, is this belief that they were racially incapable of understanding what it means to be an American. We can catch this, though, as well through the Chief Justice Melville Fuller, who wrote the dissent in Wong Kim Ark. He's quoting another case that had come a couple of years earlier called the Fang Yuting case. So this is actually from Fang Yuting, but he is quoting it here. And we can appreciate that this sentiment was very much in control of the many thoughts in the court and beyond. And so they write there, after some years' experience under the treaty, specifically the Burlingame Treaty of 1868, the government of the United States was brought to the opinion that the presence within our territory of large numbers of Chinese laborers of a distinct race and religion, remaining strangers in the land, residing apart by themselves, tenaciously adhering to the customs and usages of their own country, unfamiliar with our institutions, and apparently incapable of assimilating with our people, might endanger good order and be injurious to the public interest, and therefore requested and obtained from China a modification of the treaty. Again, without getting super into the details, referring to an 1880 treaty known as the Angle Treaty. But we see here, especially at the end, right, this idea of them being incapable of assimilating, right? And that's what I meant by earlier, by this idea that Asians were racially incapable, right? They just had this inability to truly understand what it meant to be an American. Again, this wasn't just a sentiment, to stop sharing for a moment. It wasn't just some sentiment that they felt, that they were thinking about. They translated that sentiment into law. They translated it into as many laws as possible to prevent Asians from immigrating to the United States, and as much as possible to prevent them from becoming citizens. Even the birthright citizenship, and that's why that passage I shared a moment ago about that fear that it could endanger the citizenship of the children of European immigrants, right? Even there, that's really what it was about. It wasn't just about the protection of Asians, birthright citizenship. It was just as much about that fear. We can appreciate the ways in which these laws, which went on for well over a century, these laws and policies collectively serve to remind people to really intensify this belief that Asians were racially incapable of being American, of understanding what it truly meant to be an American, and therefore should be treated accordingly by law. And again, we see this here from immigration to citizenship to, of course, Japanese internment. In what ways were these laws and policies used were a reflection of that belief? And in what ways do we continue to see, right, this kind of reflection? The present day result is this forever foreigner mentality, right? Even today, right, and to end, we want to look at, to bridge the past and the present, right? United States versus Wong Kim Ark has not been overturned, right? Like the Dred Scott case, it was overturned by the 13th Amendment. Plessy versus Ferguson, which dealt with Jim Crow segregation, was later overturned by Brown versus Board of Education in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. United States versus Wong Kim Ark, specifically Justice Horace Gray's opinion, saying that subject to the jurisdiction only refers to everybody is subject other than these exceptions, like the ambassadors and the enemy nations, right? This case is still the law today. This case has not been overturned in any way. So Horace Gray's interpretation still stands as the law. Let there be no question about it. There are many people out there, most of whom would identify as Republican conservative, who absolutely do not like the ruling in Wong Kim Ark. And if they had the first opportunity they would overturn this ruling. And we see even in Congress over the past several years, there's been a bill, HR 140, which I'm going to share right here to end, that specifically deals with this idea. So let me just read it. Let's just read HR 140, which has been introduced in the past several Congresses. Nothing has happened from it, and there's no sign that nothing's going to happen in the near future. But we see that this is still being put out there. So HR 140 says the following: this bill limits birthright citizenship by redefining what it means to be subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. Currently, a person born in the United States and subject to U.S. jurisdiction is entitled to citizenship. Under the bill, a person is subject to U.S. jurisdiction if he or she is born to a parent who is 1, a U.S. citizen or national, 2, a lawful permanent resident residing in the United States, or 3, an alien performing active service in the armed forces. And that says it doesn't affect anyone from right before the enactment of the bill. So we see here, there's the phrase again. It all comes down to how you define, how do you interpret subject to the jurisdiction? That's why I put that question out there explicitly. What exactly does that mean, subject to the jurisdiction? Of course, as we can appreciate here, this is going, here they're trying to target children who are born here of parents who are undocumented immigrants. That's, as we see here in the second part there. And so they're trying to redefine what it means. Again, this bill has not gone anywhere in Congress, and there's no sign, at least right now, that it's about to in the near future. But it's a reminder that this idea that there are many people, as I said, who do not like the ruling in Wong Kim Ark. But we see there that the courage of one Chinese American, right, who was born almost 150 years ago, and his courage to stand up in the face of the oppression being aimed at him and other Chinese Americans, we see how that made a difference. Right, we see how his courage, and his bravery to go up against a court which had shown itself to be in many ways hostile to the interests of Chinese Americans in many ways, we can appreciate that story. And we can think about today, right? As we look at how does this, why does this matter today? We can appreciate how all of these laws and policies ultimately serve to oppress, not just oppress Chinese Americans and other Asian Americans, but to cement that idea that Asians are forever and perpetually foreign. They can never really be American, and therefore, where are you from does not mean they're not looking for Los Angeles or Tennessee, right? That's not what they're asking for. That assumption. And we can understand better, not just that, as I said, from the model minority to the forever foreigner, to really any stereotype associated with any racial group, we can apply the same ideas. In what ways did the laws and policies of the past, even those, again, these policies like the citizenship, the aliens ineligible to citizenship, that policy was ultimately repealed fully in 1952, which is, again, is not that long ago. But we see here, it has been a long time. Been a while since it was, 70 years now, since anybody who is any immigrant can become a citizen. But we can appreciate then, as we think about our own experiences, right? We're going to hear from, a poem by one of our panelists, Amanda Jo, and we'll be able to understand better in what ways do these stereotypes, such as this perpetual foreigner stereotype, affect the Asian American experience today. And we can ultimately see, by looking at this history, again, this is the exact kind of history that, in the last point I want to make here, is we know that the exact conversation that I've had today, if I were, say, in a place like Iowa or Oklahoma, and this was a high school class, I could get in trouble for it, because many states are passing laws banning the teaching of critical race theory. It's become sort of like a big term lately. And everything I've said here is drawing in one way or another from critical race theory. And so you can appreciate why people are fighting, not against critical race theory, but fighting against those who are fighting against the theory, saying that by banning this sort of talk, we're basically preventing conversations exactly like this. So ultimately silence these kinds of stories that will prevent us from understanding why we are where we are today. Why do we see so much anti-Asian violence today? And that without this history, precisely these kind of conversations, we're not going to understand where this all, where this comes from, why it's not surprising that we see this, this spike and rise in anti-Asian violence. And so, and I look at these arguments against critical race theory, and I think to myself, like, none of this even distantly, even remotely resembles anything I teach in my classes when I'm, drawing from critical race theory. It's not even close. And then we can see the ways in which there's an attempt ultimately to remove exactly this kind of history, to remove these kinds of stories. And so, and that's how I can end, is to say it's a reminder, as it's famously said, the past is never dead. It's not even past. And I love that quote, because the last word, he uses the word, William Faulkner uses the word past. It should say past. He's really misspelling it. And it's a great play on words, right? To use the word past, P-A-S-T, instead of the other one, which is the second one, P-A-S-S-E-D. That's the way he should be spelling it. And it's a great way to remind us, right? The past is never dead. It's always around us. And it's saying that by understanding this history, we can come to a better understanding of where we are today, which gives us the power to be able to improve our situation for the future. Right, that you can, for those of your university students and high school students, what can you do today to make your world better? And a part of that is taking the time, as you've been here today, to learn precisely about this history that can equip you with with this sort of knowledge. Because they always say knowledge is power. And I say, sort of, I like, as one of my students put it recently, I think said it best, applied knowledge is power. To use this knowledge for the betterment of your communities and for the betterment of the society that you're entering into as adults. And so with that, thank you so much for being here. And I'll be here for any questions, that you have about the lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Really, thank you so much, Dr. Hutchison, for such a powerful, wonderful, and touching talk. I think now we're gonna pass on to Amanda Jo, one of our panelists. Amanda, would you please introduce yourself a little bit first?
Thank you so much. So, hi everyone. My name is Amanda Zhou. I'm from Memphis, and I'm Chinese-born American here. And so, first, I want to thank Professor Hutchison. I think, like Professor Huang said, it was a really powerful speech. Not only talking about the culture around this stigma against Asian Americans, but also what the government has done, the laws, the policy, the court cases that are behind all of this for decades. The history is always there, and like you said, it's never dead. And I actually did not know about the pun on words, past and past. So thank you for bringing that to my attention. And so, like Professor Hutchison said, I'm just going to analyze a really quick poem that I think also speaks to this anti-Asian sentiment and, again, not only what's happening right now, especially with the rise of Asian hate during the pandemic, but also the history behind it and things that have happened before that also leads up to this and allows people to do something like this. So I'll just share my screen really quickly. And could somebody let me know if they could see my screen?
Yes, yeah, I can see it.
Great, thank you. So in Chinese, there's a term called 群众, and I basically use this to talk about the community. And so I break it up between two parts, and it's kind of a poetic use of words almost, but for the first part, I talk about 群, and I talk about the justice that people have been trying to achieve behind this and all of the different types of just like protests that have been going on, some cultural appropriation that has been going on for not only Asian American culture or Asian culture in general, but also people of color, POC culture. So a lot of cultural appropriation issues are rising now. So I talk a little bit about this and also the model minority myth. And so first, I talk about the protests that have been happening, not only for BLM, Black Lives Matter, but also against Asian hate. And in here, I also reference crying for the lives lost, the lives taken by a single bullet shot by a hateful man. And I actually wrote this poem to give someone some perspective and some context right after the shooting happened in Atlanta, Georgia, where it was a racist man who shot 8 Asian women. And the motivation behind it was very clearly that these women were Asian. And so this was written right after that event happened. And I was consuming a lot of media that was just highlighting all of this anti-Asian sentiment. So again, the protesting that people have been doing, the cultural appropriation of something called a qipao, which in Asian culture, there's also different forms of it in Korea. It's a very traditional worn gown, and it's worn for special occasions like weddings, ceremonies, Chinese New Year, etc. And so also there's one in Vietnam, but an issue that's been arising is people take this very exotic look and they run with it and they say this is fashion, and they crop it so they're very revealing, very exposing, and they stick chopsticks in their hair and call it a very exotic look. And so there's a very fine line between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation. And so I think the line is drawn where things like this culture is sexualized in not only America, but it's normalized too. And so again, cultural appropriation within the Asian culture of having that like exotic look is, again, it's sexualizing this beautiful culture that has gone back hundreds and thousands of years to traditional clothing. And so finally, I also talk about the model minority myth that says that Asians should be quiet, we should be passive, submissive, and just like staying quiet again. And that kind of turned a lot of people into a very easy target as scapegoats. So here I kind of address how it was a scapegoat for the 20th century when jobs were stolen, like the gold rush, a lot of Chinese came over and there was a lot of back push on that. People were saying that not only Chinese people, but also like Mexicans who were coming over and immigrating during that time, that they were stealing the jobs of Americans. So kind of turning the scapegoat into the 20th century in the 1900s, but now also turning into the scapegoat of the 21st century for the pandemic, saying again, like, go back to where you came from. These phrases that have been in the headlines for quite a while now, almost a year, I would say, how Asians and Chinese people have brought over this virus and kind of ruined the world with this. So for kind of creating this model minority myth into being a scapegoat for lives lost due to the pandemic, through shops closed, again, because of the pandemic, and the filth that flies through the air. But I also touch on how there's a beautiful type of culture to this Asian American culture. And some people who aren't educated might think, oh, it's just food, it's exotic, it's maybe even some people call it weird. I remember personally when I was in middle school, and I think a lot of people also share the same story, where I would go to school during lunch and I take out my lunch and it's dumplings or it's something different, something weird, something foreign. And people say, ew, what's that? What's that weird smell coming from? Oh, it's the Chinese girl over there. And everyone else had peanut butter jelly sandwiches and salads. And I'd be so envious of them. I'd say, Mom, I want a normal lunch. But they're normal is very subjective. It's what's normal to me. And at that time, again, it's like the assimilation kind of thing that I should be try to be as American as possible to fit in with my other peers. But going to a predominantly white school, that's a story that I have and I've seen so many people have as well. But so this part kind of addresses the culture, the beautiful culture around it, how for example, this came from like a personal experience, these few lines right here, where a lot of Chinese parents or grandparents who come over for just a few months or a year or so will come over and live with their families and their grandsons and granddaughters. And what they would do was they planted a whole garden in the backyard, just like how they would do in China. And so through this, they had, I remember during my summers when I was a child, we would get around 20 cucumbers a day from the backyard and so many tomatoes. And what we do is we wash them and we package them and we send them to friends. And it's like our own cucumbers that we grew in our backyard are going out to these people and just as like a little gift, not even as like, oh, you're hungry or something, here's something to eat. It's more like, this is a token of love, almost. This is a community. And so through culture like this, which also, again, like Chinese New Year, I know a lot of teachers who don't really recognize Chinese New Year as a holiday to have a good, it's not a good excuse. I've heard some people say, or some teachers say, to not have homework done or to take a day off from school, even though like Christmas gets 2 weeks off. Chinese New Year is not really recognized as something like that, but I can just recall the memories where we had gala performances on stage and we would sing Chinese folk songs. A lot of grandparents who only understood Chinese felt a lot of pride during this time because their granddaughters and grandsons were on stage singing fully Chinese songs and being fluent in them. And so also performing the Chinese martial arts called wushu. And so during Chinese New Year, it's just a time of laughter, it's fun, it's just like Christmas in America, kind of. And so I incorporated a little phrase like Happy New Year right here, 新年快乐. And so again, just incorporating some of this culture into this beautiful world as well. And so in the end, I talk a little bit more about how this means community. It means the good parts and the bad parts, where we're fighting for rights, we're fighting for continually not being seen as foreign people who are weird and bring filth to the country. We belong here too. I belong here. I'm not going back to where I came from. I came from America and not somewhere else, but how this community has been suffering a lot, especially during the height of the pandemic and the rise of Asian hate crimes. But how we should also group together. Asian Americans are part of people of color. And so how we should also sympathize and kind of connect with the POC community in general, and how I think, kind of as cliche as it sounds, together, if we come together, we can fight this and not just be loners and quote unquote like the model myth minority, where we just stay quiet and become submissive about all of the hate that's been received. So yeah, that's kind of what I wrote about in the phrase 群众, which means community. And so yeah, thank you for letting me share this.
Thank you. That is such a beautiful and touching poem. I encourage and I invite everyone to type their comments or questions in the chat if they have anything to say, to comment about your poem or on the talk. But because we are kind of running out of time, so I would invite all of our panelists to just give their questions first, and maybe at the end, Dr. Hutchison, you could maybe respond to some of the questions or all of the questions. Maybe we can combine some of them. Would that be okay? Yeah, okay. So thank you again, Amanda. And Teresa or Kevin, would you guys like to, do you have any questions for Dr. Hutchison, or did you just have to, have any questions for us to discuss? If you do, please go ahead. Maybe Teresa, would you like to speak first?
Sure. I do have a few questions written down. So one of my questions was, are there any trends in the treatment of Asian Americans that might repeat in the future?
Well, could you repeat the first part? I'm sorry, I didn't catch. It broke off just for a second.
Yeah. Are there any trends in the treatment of Asian Americans that you think might repeat in the future?
Yeah, the first part, yeah, I'm not catching one of the words. Yeah, are there any, I think I hear the word transitions.
Let me try something real quick.
Yeah.
Are there any trends in the treatment?
Trends. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, could you say the question one more time? Sorry, third time's a charm, right? Okay, any trends that might repeat? Yes, and yeah, I got So that happens in my classes all the time. I'm like, I'll get it. Don't worry. Unfortunately, it goes back to what I had mentioned earlier about that this is not surprising, right? That this rise in anti-Asian violence, and I, thinking about my classes I've taught, over the years, I said, that there's something like this, like we're talking about Japanese internment. We start to see, of course, the details are going to be different, but that's why it's so important to see, what can we do? And this is a larger question, right? There's no easy answer for this, but we already see, even like Amanda in your poem, we already see good examples of, people who are standing up and saying that it's going to take a collective movement, right? People of color, their white allies, right? To say, how can we change the discourse? How can we change the, because that's what we start to realize, that what we're really up against, because we're dealing with a stereotype that has really been in formation and solidified well over a century. And that's, I think, one of the big, the daunting challenges, that especially for those of us, in high school and college, right? This is the world you're inheriting, and you're seeing what it can do. We can, because like Amanda, as you perfectly shared, right? We see the ways in which it comes out, right? The idea, that's, perfect way of putting it. Well, define normal, right? What does that mean? And so it's a reminder of just how many ways in which these ideas come out, and the ways in which it's so, as I like to put in some of my classes, baked into the system. And it's this, and that's why I say law and policy are a part of that, not the only thing, but it's also a part of it that we have to look at. We have to, we have to realize, even though we don't have any direct policies, again, like about immigration or citizenship, but at the same time, we do. This is where we realize, let's not pretend, right? This is like, oh, we'll just overcome racism. I'm sure it'll be gone by next year, I'm sure. And we realize unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. We start to realize how deeply rooted a lot of this is. And that's, I know, can be some of the discouragement, but it also can give us, not just, instead of discouragement, it can give us resolve. And that's why the idea of solidarity, like Amanda, like you mentioned, very importantly, right? It's not just about you or, the people immediately around you, or only the people in your racial ethnic group. It's saying that's why solidarity is so important, but especially why we start to see the ways in which, racial groups, like groups of color, are pitted against each other, right? Noting that, a small, but about a quarter, they say, of hate crimes, during the pandemic have been committed by other people of color, including some of the high profile ones. Obviously, the Atlanta shooter was white, but some of the other high profile had been by other people of color. And so that's a reminder of even the added work that needs to be done. That even the model minority myth was, initially, well, even in the very name, model minority. Well, model for who, right? Not just a minority, but a model for other minority groups, especially Blacks, Native Americans, Latinx people to supposedly emulate. The whole point of the model minority was to divide Asian Americans from other groups. And so that's a lot of that work that needs to be done. And just like even in this situation, we see great examples of those who are working to bring groups together in a larger society, trying to drive people apart. So when I think of those trends, Teresa, as your question, is that's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about those, the ways in which this, in what other ways can this forever foreigner, unfortunately, it shows up from from being made fun of for the lunch that you're eating. These are all manifestations of, and we start to appreciate how deeply rooted it is. But in that appreciation, it can produce that resolve. What can we do about this, right? How can we fight against this? And not just imagine, just hopefully we'll wake up tomorrow and society will be better, but what can we do on a cultural level, on a political level, whatever it is, right? Because everything's important that we can collectively make our society better. And so, yeah, absolutely, that's a great question. Yeah, about the various trends, absolutely.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, so I have a question about ethnic enclaves. So how do you think that ethnic enclaves played a role in incorporating Asians into American society? Because I know that they unify the Asian community, but they can also separate different ethnicities.
Yeah, I think part of it is, that's a great question. When we think of ethnic enclaves, I think this would be another part of history, right? That, I could have talked about as well, is that many, like the earliest Chinatowns, it served a dual role in the sense of acclimating, Chinese immigrants. I'm talking about like the earliest ones from the, mid-late 1800s, especially in places like San Francisco and Los Angeles, the earliest Chinatowns. Like the earliest Chinatown in San Francisco was completely destroyed by the San Francisco earthquake of 1906. And so it was rebuilt to where it is today. And so we see that it not only does that, but it was, in terms of that role of providing educational resources, right? Different kinds of training, even legal, right? Like Wong Kim Ark, one thing I could also add is that Wong Kim Ark didn't fight by himself, right? He was helped out, I'll just put it in the chat here, by a group called the, let's see if I can type this right, the Chinese Six Companies. And they were a group of Chinese who also had associations in China who provided legal help and counsel. So he was not alone in that regard. That should be added as well. And so we see that's partially what Chinatowns did that, but we also have to remember that it was rooted, a lot of it was also rooted in white racism, basically saying, why were they in Chinatowns? Because they weren't allowed to live anywhere else, and they were completely barred from living. And then of course, because they were forced in very small areas of the city, the population density was very high. And that then produced this stereotype that Asians were producing diseases, right? That they were blamed in some cases for some diseases that were emerging in places like San Francisco. But it's like part of the reason this is happening is because the racism is forcing Chinese to all live together in very close quarters because they're not given any other options. So these oppressive laws are then creating a situation that then for many white Americans confirmed these very stereotypes, if that makes sense, right? You do the very things and then produce the very situation, then they can look at it and say, see, we were right to oppress them all along. See, look what happened. We were right about basically, in a sense, segregating them, so to speak, into these, cloistering them into these small spaces here. And so today, obviously we're in a much different situation today, but I think, part of it is, like Kevin, like you said, what ways can these ethnic enclaves like Chinatown here in Los Angeles, which is facing a lot of challenges from like the Walmarts of the world, right? In what ways can that also be a fight for, to, just like Amanda said, right? You're also in America, but that's part of what it means to be an American, as much as that gets challenged, right? You have to eat normal food, right? This is what it supposedly means. It's saying that how can we reimagine something different about what it really means to be an American, because we're fighting against, right? That definition has been given from elsewhere. And so, this is the ways in which ethnic enclaves can produce, can continue to produce a positive impact on communities and their necessary function, but also, being proactive about that solidarity with other groups, right? It's not just, it's Little Tokyo working with Chinatown, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So,
Thank you so much. If there is no more questions from our panelists, I would like to direct our attention to the audience. We do have one question from Gianna Zhang. She asked, how do you think this word, alien? My parents said recently USCIS changed this word on immigration official form. So do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, with that, I don't know the details about the recent change. My reply, my partial reply in that regard would be that, these are loaded terms. Obviously, we can, and I'm sure this is coming from, the idea they were called aliens ineligible to citizenship. And it's a reminder, if anything, that words matter. Right. When I said before, when I was talking about HR 140, right, I'm very crucial about that. I'm not going to say illegal alien. I'm going to say undocumented immigrant, right? They're not aliens, right? What does that mean? Because there's so much baggage. There's so many assumptions that are embedded in that, even in the words that we use. And that's why that's also such an important aspect. And so the changing these words on the official forms for immigration, that they're not using that, without knowing more, I'd have to know more to speak on it. But my sense is that that could be a positive a development, right? They're saying, because again, words matter, the words we use. What does that mean? To use a word like alien, that's going to invoke some things like, are they from Mars or something? And so I think that's, without knowing more, I would say that could be a positive change there. Why, the reasons behind why they're doing that, to say, that we'll say undocumented. That's a better way, because the ideas of aliens and those being illegal is going to evoke, again, which we've seen, especially in the last, half century, especially since, the 1970s, in which a lot of most of that immigrant hysteria aimed at immigrants from Mexico, Central, South America. Again, there's so much being said, and again, as a matter, really what it serves to do, to put it this way, right? It serves what they would call, an othering practice as a means to, let's emphasize how Asians, how Latinx people are other. They're just different from us. And therefore, we've got to do whatever it takes to exclude them, whether through the policies of the past or building a wall, at the Mexican border, right? These are all ways of doing that. And the words we use are also going to continue to other. So that's I don't know more details about what, the reasons for the change, but that's a great question. It's a reminder of why the words we use are important. What do we call people, right? What terms do we use? And that's why even things like pronouns, right? Using the pronouns, why is that important? And then we can get a better understanding of that. So that's an important question. Yeah, no doubt.
Thanks for that. And any other questions from the audience or from the panelists?
I did want to put in the case I mentioned. I think Sharon mentioned.
Right.
Gribble versus Hall. That was in 1854. Let me copy paste. Hold on one second. Let me find. There it is. We go back to the PlayStation terms of service. I'm sure we all want to read that again, right? So. That's great. It's not the full. This link here. It doesn't give the entire case, because again, it just focuses on the major parts, the binding aspects of it here. But that has the main part of the ruling there, the People versus Hall, which I would argue is something I've written about, and I actually say much more about. That was actually my second choice to really focus on for this presentation. That was the second one. The one can work one out in that case. But this is the first big case that I talk about. The earliest really significant case in Asian American history in this regard, especially when we see just how negative the ruling was. Again, they justify, why can't China, it's not, they basically said, if we're not going to allow Chinese to testify against white people, it's not because we white people have horns growing out of our head and are just inherently evil people, and that's just who we are. It's because Chinese, and they list off all these stereotypes. They argue that Chinese are natural liars, that they are inferior mentally, intellectually, which I usually say to my classes, that's not what we say about, Asian Americans today. If anything, the model minority is just the opposite. But we spent much of our history arguing that Asian Americans, Asian people were intellectually inferior. So what changed, right? We know that, as I always say to my classes, Asian people did not change, right? They didn't suddenly get a new chromosome or something, right? The laws and policies changed such that it now became politically expedient to start to praise them as a means to divide Asians from other groups, especially in the civil rights movement, especially in like Black Power, as an express means to create a split within groups and to pit them against each other. Exactly the kind of thing that even here, we can fight against and produce that solidarity. But again, that's what we see. It was always a justification behind it. this is why we can't allow Chinese, not because we're bad people, but because they are. They're obviously lying. These witnesses, these Chinese witnesses are obviously lying about what happened. And so this is why they can't be trusted. And so we need to reflect that, because this is who they are, and it's racial, and that's an aspect of it, right? It's not like, well, we can just teach them about America and teach them how to not be liars. He said, no, it's in their nature to be liars. It's like it's in their blood. And if this is the case, it can't be changed. And it makes no sense to allow Chinese to testify against white people. What kind of sense does that make? And so we can see this is what ultimately undergirds and reinforces these laws. It's all about, here's why we're doing it. And of course, all this, being rooted, of course, in racist beliefs. And that's what ultimately has to be challenged, is this idea that human beings are, by dint of their racial group, are somehow magically different from each other. Race, as I say to my, as I talk about my racial theory classes, race is always about division. It's all about, you are not like me. Our lives are not meant to touch in any meaningful way beyond hostility, beyond division. It's saying, what can we do to challenge those walls that race divides us with, right? This whole idea of race. And so it's not just about, here's why we're doing this, because the people in this group are dangerous and inferior people, and we have to protect ourselves from them. Right? Black people are inherently inferior. They should be slaves. In fact, slavery is a benefit, they said in the Dred Scott case. We're doing this to benefit them. And so anyway, we see, again, those are a lot more examples I could give of that. But that's one of the challenges we see. But that's why that People versus Hall case is, the first really big, important case in the earliest parts of Asian American history, especially when we realize how negative it was and its implications. Very important.
Maybe we'll have to have you come back and do another webinar or seminar.
Versus Hall,
on this second case. It sounds so interesting, and I want to take your course and myself. I believe I speak for all of our audience. Your classes sound so interesting, and I think it's very important that you have emphasized to study the history of not just Chinese American, but also the concept of race, how it was developed over the time. I remember reading about the history of the Asian people, or Chinese and Japanese people. I remember vaguely that back in the 17th century, when the missionaries traveled to China and Japan, they defined in their diaries, they defined them as white people because they willingly accepted Christianity. So at that time, the standards, how people define skin color or race based on Christianity. So over the time, it got changed. So it's really subject, right? And when we look into the history, it's really interesting. We can find a lot of contradictory concepts. And at the same time, you brought up the very important concept of temporality, right? History versus the present. History is not past; it's constantly being brought back to present, or even invented, reinvented, produced in the present to justify something. So I think the connection that you are making here is really important. At the same time, the question of spatiality is very important too. It's not just the Chinese American in the United States; it's all over the world. It's such a it's a very universal question. So I think through today's seminar, we all learned so much. So thank you so much again. And if you have, let me see. I think we have one last question from Mei Qing Wang, who is also a professor at CSUN in art history. She asked this question: putting in the context of nation politics, can we think about the problems of nationalism in light of racism? This is a very complicated question. Would you please respond to that question?
Absolutely. I was just thinking about, and because it's I'm going to, hopefully by the time I put in the title of this book, one of my hopefully I'll magically remember the name of the author. It's actually a French author. It's a brief book called, it's translated from the French, called Race is About Politics, by Jean-Frédéric Schaub. I may have misspelled that. I don't think that's got that right. Where he talks about, in what ways, he's looking at, where did race come from? When exactly did these nationalist politics become specifically racial? And he traces this history, not just from Europe, but, especially in Europe, about, we see these ideas of royalty, right? There was something in their blood that made them, But he's saying that's not racial. When exactly did that idea, from like the Spanish Inquisition, when did these ideas of religion and royalty become specifically racial? As he says, it's, we also have to look at, the idea of race, this idea that some aspects of a person's physical appearance is indicating who a person is on the inside. That's really what it's about, right? It's not about the physical appearance. It's what that physical appearance supposedly communicates, is ultimately to say that, we see it's ultimately new. It's only about 400 or 500 years old, but it's not completely novel. And so we can see the ways in which racism is drawing upon previous discourses on religion, on, again, nationalism, the ways in which these terms come together. We see that during the Holocaust, right? We see that, Hitler, and Schaub talks about this, this idea of, Hitler, of course, is drawing on science, but it's not completely, right? He didn't have the human genome to draw off of. How exactly do you determine a Jewish genetics or what have you? And so, we see that and that's why if we, which again, in my class, I get into a lot more, if race is a social construction, a human invention that doesn't exist in nature, then it shouldn't surprise us that we see these contradictory, right? The way race developed in the US is different than the way it developed, say, in Latin America, right? Where they, here in the US, it was all about you're white or you're black. They really tried to avoid, the mixed race terms, whereas Latin America, that was much more common, so the ways in which, this idea of nationalism is also going to latch on in some contexts more than others. And so here, right, the idea of white nationalism, what does that mean? So that's an important aspect as well. So racism is going to draw upon aspects of nationalism, but cannot be subsumed under it. That would be that would be the quick answer for that anyway, because there's still going to be something distinctive about it. That we, of course, see nationalism precedes racism, but the two are, again, there's going to be a complex relationship, between them, no doubt.
Thank you so much. Okay, we're about 5 minutes over time, but I would like to end our webinar here just to respect everyone's time. So please join me in thanking Dr. Hutchison for his wonderful talk today. And I would like to thank you all for coming to this webinar on Saturday at night, at a Saturday night. So hopefully you enjoy. I enjoyed greatly tonight's talk. So if you don't have any other questions, I would like to end it here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.